Well, let's start. On behalf of the Forests Out of Red Coalition, welcome to this science briefing on forest biomass and the Renewable Energy Directive. The Forests Out of Red Coalition is a broad coalition of civil society organizations across the EU and the US, asking for ending the support for primary woody biomass to be part of energy purposes in the red. My name is Delia Villagraza, and I'm a senior advisor to PFPI, the Partnership for Policy Integrity, a think tank focusing on forest biomass issues. We hope that this event will provide you with an opportunity to hear from top scientists about why we recommend that policymakers end incentives for forest biomass in the Renewable Energy Directive. In particular, we have basically 3 calls on policymakers to work on, which we believe are particularly important. 1, to stop the billions of subsidies and other incentives going to the forest biomass industry, because it's very destructive and you will hear why. 2, make sure that wood is being treated as the highly valuable resource it is. That means using it across the EU according to a clearly defined and common cascading principle. The cascading principle is basically common sense. It means use wood according to its highest economic, ecological, and climate value, ensuring that burning it for energy is really a last resort for secondary woody biomass, such as wood mill residues only. And number 3, ensure a scientifically accurate definition of primary woody biomass, so that it is really clear what can be counted in the red and what not. The discussion after the presentations will allow you to ask questions and go into the science in more depth. Please also feel free to use the chat function to ask questions. And when you're not speaking, please mute yourself. And we are recording the presentations, but not the discussion. So all that said, I would like to introduce our panel now. We have 3 distinguished panelists: Professor Karlheinz, Director of the Institute of Social Ecology at the University of Natural Resources and Life Sciences in Vienna, Austria; Dr. Michael Norton, Environment Program Director of the European Academies of Science Advisory Council, the EASAC, in the UK, so he's currently in Japan. Thank you for joining us so late in your day. And Dr. Mary Booth, the Director of the Partnership for Policy Integrity, based in the US. So without further ado, I would like to give the word to Professor Oeb.
Thank you very much, Delia. Try to share my screen, 1 second. Let me see if it's running. 1 second. Oops. Do you see the presentation? Is all good?
Perfect.
Perfect. Very good. So I'm very thankful that I can talk today about the role of forests, of the red for the forests and as well for the climate. I have a very short presentation here, which will try to give you home 3 messages. First of all, wood is something which is essential for the ecosystem integrity of forests. There are some basics from ecosystem science. Some are very trivial. The other ones are relatively key to what we are discussing this day. First of all, wood is renewable, but it is a strictly limited and delicate resource. Wood builds photosynthetic towers. It creates structure, and we know many assets of ecosystems attached to this structure. Biodiversity, for instance. Wood is food for the forest web of life. We know that. Wood and forests are cooling down and wetten the wider landscape. And on the right-hand side, you see some images on that. You see these bluish areas. This is where wood and trees introduce a cooler microclimate than otherwise expected. And the last point here, and this is key, wood is a long-term carbon storage. It is a massive carbon storage, so there's a lot of carbon stored in wood, And wood is for a very, very long time a carbon sink. It is sequestering carbon. If you look at the presentation, oh, I see I have a, if you look at the presentation here, we see that woods, even at the age of above 300 years, are still sequestering carbon. They are still not in the equilibrium of mortality and increment. And this is important, this is key. Then wood actually need more. Forests need more wood and not less. Why is that so? Well, first of all, we have today a carbon stock gap. So the carbon today in forest is much, much less than the carbon that would be there. The upper right map shows you the global image on that. And here are some data from the German average. You see that the European and the German average are far behind or below the European primary forests. Well, forest ecosystem integrity is already going down. We know that globally, and also in Austria, we have and in Europe, we have biodiversity loss. Here we did some work about the impact of land use intensity, which is severe and which plays a role also in forests. And then, let me try to get rid of that. And then climate today is already impacting forest stands. But the key point is that the sustainability criteria of the Renewable Energy Directive is not working against these trends. It does still allow damaging practices such as clear cutting. Because we have this gap in forests, we also have another thing, which is kind of a good thing. We have a carbon sink. Forests today act as a carbon sink. If you have a look here, 14% worth of the European GHG emissions are compensated by the forest carbon sinks, which means, on the other hand, if we get rid of this carbon sink, we have either 14% higher emissions, or we have a very strong mitigation pressure to the other sectors just to stay at the same level. This is important. Why is it important? Well, the carbon sink does not come for free. The carbon sink is the balance of increments and drains. So forest growing and whatever is lost from the forest is taken out of the forest. And we cannot do things at the same time. We cannot harvest more and at the same time have higher sinks. Either we harvest or we have a sink. If we harvest much, the sink will be lost. And you will see later that this is already happening in Europe. And even if forest management today aims to increase increment, which is the growth rates, usually the faster growing species we have, they are indeed growing faster, but they create much less carbon stocks than the primary forests would. So the stocks, and this is a key, they are the currency of mitigation. They are the currency of the climate issue. It's not about flows. It's not about sucking up. It's about storing. This is the key thing. And this is also important. With climate change, the future growth rates will probably be smaller and they are extremely uncertain. So counting that we are able to increase the sink and the harvest for a long period of time is not really sensible. Actually, more harvest means less carbon sinks, even and in particular if forest change is going on. Now I have prepared for you a slide which gives us a flavor. What would happen if we would use up this increment? Apparently, forests are growing because we do not use as much as it is growing there. And here you see data from the GRC. They tell us 600 million cubic meters are felled, trees are felled in forests each year. So here 600, and this is where we make energy and material from. But about 350 million cubic meters we leave in the forests. This is the carbon sink, which is sucking up carbon every year. If we use that to create additional energy by sacrificing the sink, we will get something like 3.2 exajoules per year. Well, this is a lot of energy, of course. Exajoule is an immensely big number. This is the amount of energy we can get there. But this comes at very, very high costs. First of all, we sacrifice the annual sink. So we have energy, but we don't have the sink anymore. This will lead to immediate emissions. Why? Because the carbon emission intensity of biomass is much, much higher than even of coal. It is higher than coal, it is much higher than fossil gas. So we will have immediate higher emission if we don't change on the other side. And we have an opportunity cost. We lose opportunities. For instance, we could decide to harvest less, to produce less wood energy, and leave the material growing in the forests. We would have the stocks still active, and they would continue to suck up carbon. So we have a very high opportunity cost. Well, why is this important? Because if there is additional energy taken from the forest, this means there will be primary forest. It will not be cascading. But if we link the wood resource to the energy market, there is a very high probability that this energy market, which is really using a lot of energy, that this is really giving a big dynamics into the forest harvests. You see with these 3.2 exajoules, which we calculate here, we can only cover 5.5% of the energy use in the EU. Well, why is this important? Emissions, we have to avoid that emissions increase, but we also have to avoid that the wrong incentives are given. And here the IPCC tells us a very interesting number. In a just recent publication, they figured out that on the average, by the mechanisms avoid, shift, and improve, we could, for instance, in the building sector, absorb or reduce or mitigate about 80% of the energy used in buildings, which means the energy used in building is 11 exajoules per year. If we take 80% of that, it would be around 8 exajoules a year. We can save energy we would not need. This is quite a number in comparison to sacrificing actually wood integrity for getting rid of the carbon sink. Yeah, so it is very important to know we have other solutions. There are options there, but, and this is important, avoid, shift, and improve requires time. But because we are selling opportunity costs, the bioenergy in itself is a selling time device, if you wish. We lose the sink, we create opportunity costs, and this creates lock-ins, which will lead to a delayed transformation of our energy system. And to sum up here, what we have seen, forests are under severe pressures for climate change, for harvests, and we have biodiversity impacts. Forests show a management-induced carbon stock gap, and this is the reason why we have carbon sinks today active working and mitigating for the emissions we create. Using the forests for whatever purpose reduces the sink, and we have a trade-off there. Yeah, and forest bioenergy comes to a very high cost to the forests, to the climate, and to biodiversity, eventually for a low reward, for not so much as we can do with other options, because better options exist: solar, wind, geothermal, just to mention a few. And the Renewable Energy Directive sustainability criteria do not prevent the damaging practices, because they focus solely on the extent to which wood is provided. It is a sustainable wood provision. It is not sustainable in terms of ecological functioning. And with that, I would like to thank you very much and hand over, I guess, to Delia. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Karlheinz. We will take questions at the end of all presentations, so I'll go straight to Michael Norton. Please, Mike.
Sharing my screen and putting the slides there. Well, thank you, and it's a pleasure and honor to talk to you today. I'm the Director for the Environment Programme at the European Academies Science Advisory Council. And the first thing I should explain is that EASAC is not a campaigning NGO. We try and represent the combined wisdom of Europe's science academies, so totally independent. Our focus is very much on the interface between science and policy. And as you see in that list below, we've carried out a number of studies related to the use of forest biomass and their effect on climate change mitigation. And it's because we have concluded that there are serious questions over this that we have become engaged in the policy debate. And I'll try and summarize in 7 minutes some of the issues from a science and climate perspective. Our starting point should be to recognize that the Renewable Energy Directive is intended to reduce emissions in order to help reduce carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. There's no other way of reducing the pace of global warming, and that need has become more and more urgent as warming proceeds unchecked, as stated by the IPCC at the end of last year, shown here. At the time of the 2009 original Renewable Energy Directive, there was some basis for including biomass because its scale was small and models envisaged at the time genuine local forestry wastes whose carbon would enter the environment anyway in a relatively short time. So it was thought that it would be useful to extract some energy before that happened. Since that point, however, there's been a huge expansion to a massive international business reliant on billions of euros in subsidies, in which millions of tons of forest-based wood pellets provide the feedstock. So it's important to ask, what is this model achieving for the climate? So let's look at the bottom line. How much carbon dioxide do renewable energies emit to generate a kilowatt hour of electricity? You can see that wind and solar are basically zero emitters once they're operating, but that the emissions in their construction and installation, when averaged out over their life cycle, are about 10 to 40 grams per kilowatt hour. Now look at biomass. These are actual figures. The long and complex supply chain alone, with harvesting, drying, pelleting, and sometimes thousands of kilometer transport, emit many times more than solar and wind just on the supply chain. And you can't generate electricity without burning the biomass. It's a thermal power station, and that adds about 955 grams per kilowatt hour, making it approaching 1100 or 100 times the emissions from a kilowatt hour generated by wind. And note here that it's also more than would be the case with coal. So how can we regard such a high emitter as renewable and give it the same renewable label and eligibility for subsidies as wind and solar? The answer to that is that there are certain assumptions that have been made. One of these is that it is assumed that biomass is carbon neutral, and what that means is we see the carbon in the feedstock coming from the atmosphere during the growth of the tree and presume that it will be reabsorbed as the tree regrows. Overall, there being a net balancing in the carbon flows within the tree. And this is also helped by IPCC reporting guidance that allows emissions to be zero rated at the point they're burnt in the stack, because the carbon in the biomass is meant to have been reported under the forestry statistics where it originated. That means to avoid double counting, the entity and country that burns the biomass can ignore the carbon there. So when you see claims from industry that our absolute carbon emissions have fallen more than 85% due to a conversion to biomass from coal, it's entirely because of those statistics that allow the operator to ignore the huge amounts of carbon coming from the stack and not reflecting real reductions to the atmosphere. In reality, the atmosphere receives more than it would have done if the power station was still burning coal. Now, with coal, of course, the coal is not regenerated in a practically useful time, but the tree does regrow. So how long should it take for those extra emissions to the atmosphere to be reabsorbed? Unfortunately, that doesn't happen for a relatively long time. There are a huge number of scientific studies on this, and there is no reference to case for biomass. Each case is different, but in general, they indicate the time to pay back this carbon debt ranges from a few decades to centuries to never in the worst cases. In the big JRC study last year on woody biomass use in the EU, you can see on this where the amber and red columns relate to over 50-year categories for payback times. You can see quite a quite a number of different types of feedstock in those categories. So this is why we need strong criteria in the regulations to differentiate between different feedstocks, those that can make an early contribution to climate change in maybe 10, 20 years, and those which really have little chance of doing so. But when you look at the overall efficiency targets, you could also be forgiven for asking if this is a good use of public money, and whether that would be seen as an efficient use of such large sums of public money when the effects on climate are so questionable or delayed. There are a number of policy options which can address this problem. First one, obviously, is to exclude stem wood, and there is some move towards this and the exclusion of whole trees, as mentioned in the biodiversity strategy. And the main target would be to actually specifically recognize in the RED sustainability criteria the importance of time, and to limit feedstocks to within those only delaying by about 10 years. There are also proposals to have better transparent reporting, so we don't ignore the emissions from the stack. Those are reported, even if they don't have to be reported to the UNFCCC. And a big financial benefit is currently that biomass emissions do not get charged within the ETS. And of course, the atmosphere doesn't really differentiate between biomass carbon and coal carbon. So again, that is not supported by the science. Now, there is some changes. Some national policies are already phasing out subsidies or putting a time limit on them. And the RED 2 did actually suggest 2024 as a limit for subsidies for electricity-only biomass stations. And there's also some measures to try and improve incentives for carbon stock in the LULUCF rules. But there's still quite a lot of pressure, quite a lot of commercial efforts going to persuade people to convert more existing coal-fired power stations to biomass. And so the review of the current RED criteria is still critically important. And in parallel with that, we see the cascade principle, which the Commission has also suggested introducing, as important to express basic ground rules in using natural resources efficiently according to their value in both economic and climate terms. Let me just show you the Commission's illustration of the cascade principle, which has long-lived wood-based products at the top, and bioenergy is just one step ahead of throwing it away. But looking to the future, we anticipate additional demand for woody feedstocks as innovation develops routes to bio-based plastics or aviation fuels or bio-based chemicals. And so those uses would also have a higher priority on this cascade. But before I finish, I also need to mention that the same stakeholders who depend on subsidies for simple biomass burning some of those are looking to attract subsidies to apply the role of bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, or BECCS. And we recently concluded a study of this. And here we found models to be fundamentally flawed in the way they foresee a large role for BECCS as a means of removing CO2 from the atmosphere in the future. We don't think those forecasts are properly justified or evaluated. And when you look at the carbon flows in the whole system, it becomes difficult to design a successful BECCS project that does actually remove CO2 in a useful timescale. Therefore, you do need, in this case as well, full and detailed system-wide carbon accounting to show how much and when, if ever, any net negative emissions may be delivered. And our assessment on the basis of current evidence is that for large power stations importing pellets, adding CCS will not deliver net negative emissions in a practicable and useful timescale, and that the productive possibility might be limited to very local and limited scale use of genuinely waste woods or agricultural waste. So in short, to wind up, it's good that the Parliament is looking at this issue, and I hope in that you will consider that there are serious doubts over whether the billions in subsidies are achieving anything from a climate perspective, and also point out that the rather unfortunate effect of this is that many governments have become dependent on energy to meet their renewable targets, and therefore there is some resistance to change. The large subsidies are likely to have drained resources away from proven and more effective renewable energy technologies. There's a danger of repeating the same problems as proposals are received for BECCS. And the recommendation is that RED should really refocus on its primary objective to reduce atmospheric levels and aim to ensure that it can achieve this in a short time of less than 10 years. We really don't have longer than that before we even overshoot the Paris Agreement targets. And the Parliament's environment proposal on taking out primary woody biomass may be a useful start on this, but the fundamental philosophy needs to be to prioritise forest for carbon stock, biodiversity and priority applications according to the cascade. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mike. And we'll go straight to Mary so that we still have time for the questions afterwards.
Great. You seeing my
Yep.
Okay, great. I'm going to talk about how biomass harvesting in the EU is basically helping degrade the EU's forest carbon sink. Sorry, next slide here. Achieving the European Union's climate goals relies on, as has been pointed out, increasing forest carbon uptake or land sink carbon uptake in the land sink as a whole. But when you actually look at the breakdown of the different categories of the land sector, you see that all the heavy lifting is being done by forests. So land sink carbon uptake depends on forest carbon uptake. That's the green line in the negative zone down there at the bottom. The blue line is the total land sector, and then harvested wood products, which represent basically a lateral move of forest carbon. Some portion of forest carbon that is stored in long-lived wood products is counted as a sink, but it's really a minor amount compared to forests as a whole. So you can see that forests are really the beginning, middle, and end of the carbon sequestration story. Unfortunately, the European Union forest carbon sink is getting weaker because forests are mismanaged and they're overlogged, including for biomass. And even worse, European Commission climate modeling assumes biomass will increase in the future by a lot, and that BECCS will provide 250 million tons of CO2 uptake per year by 2050. This is a dangerous fantasy. So what you're seeing on this graph here is the brown line is again the total land sink. The green line is the forest carbon sink. It's pointing upward, which is a bad thing. It's becoming less negative, which means that forest carbon sequestration capacity is being lost. Normally, lines pointing upward are good things, but in this case, it's a bad thing. It's the same as emissions increasing. The legislated land sink target in 2030 for the EU as a whole is negative 310 million tons of CO2. You can see it's not very aggressive. Like, look back at 2010. The land sector was taking up more carbon in 2010 than it will be, than its legislative goal is for 2030. And yet at the same time, the EU has signed off on a forest reference level, which represents a significant loss of forest carbon. So at the same time, they're saying it's okay to log forests and lose forest carbon uptake capacity, but at the same time, we want you to increase your land sink target, your land sink overall. The modeled 2050 land sink from the European Commission is a relatively weak 350 million tons of CO2 uptake by the land sector as a whole. And it's supplemented by 250 million metric tons of CO2 uptake by BECCS. So they have baked in the assumption that a technology that does not yet exist and is probably incapable of delivering negative emissions will in fact save us. The European Union's use of forest biomass has increased a lot. Biomass overall has increased a lot. Solid biofuels is the solid red line here. Wood, which includes both mill residues, so secondary woody biomass, and then primary woody biomass, which is forest biomass, comprises the majority of solid biofuels. But I've put in an estimated level here of what forest biomass actually is. So we're talking about taking this out of the Renewable Energy Directive. It's actually pretty doable. When we look at this, we realize we're not saying nobody can burn wood. Of course, we're not saying that. What we're saying is it shouldn't be counted toward targets. And this is actually a doable goal. Meanwhile, if you look at the other kinds of renewable energy, you see how they're struggling. They're being deprived of resources, basically, because bioenergy overall gets around 17 billion a year in subsidies. So that's EU taxpayers and ratepayers paying 17 billion a year. That's money in subsidies that could be going to wind, solar, and efficiency. As Mike pointed out, or maybe it was Karlheinz, I'm sorry, now I've forgotten which one it was. The majority of biomass already burned in the EU, which is coarse woody debris, is in the high risk category as identified by the Joint Research Center. So up here we have biodiversity and ecosystem condition, which is high risk, is this quadrant over here on the right in the bottom, and then greater or equal emissions as fossil fuels for 100 years or forever. So scenario one was coarse woody debris, and that is high risk for ecosystems and climate. And that's what's being burned now, much less in the future. But let's take a look at some pictures of what's also being burned now. Increasingly, it's not just logging residues, it's actual logs. And all of these pictures were taken at biomass plants or wood pellet plants in either the EU or in the United States or British Columbia, Canada, where we have down here these massive red cedars, old growth red cedars. I personally, I did not take this picture, but I took one just like it. This is at a pellet mill, actually on its way to be made into pellets. So this is the reality of what's actually being burned for biomass in the EU. Now the chickens are coming home to roost, and we're seeing the impacts of biomass harvesting on the land sink. So Estonia and Finland, two very biomass dependent countries, both just announced that their land sinks are no longer sinks, but they are now net sources of emissions to the atmosphere. That's the red line. And you can see that the green line, which is forests, is right behind. So it'll only probably be next year that they'll announce that indeed now forests are a net sink of carbon, not just the land sink as a whole. Finland's use of forest biomass is unequivocally responsible for the decline in the forest carbon sink. As you can see, Finland has increased biomass burning a lot. That's graph A here compared to hydro and wind. The other kinds of renewable energy are so small, they don't even show up on the graph. So that's what they're doing for renewable energy in Finland. The increase is fueled by forest wood, not mill residues. Graph B, this red line is forest wood versus sawdust, chips, things like that. Those things are basically flat. And here we have use of forest chips increasing dramatically. Finland is using more wood to burn for energy than they're turning into actual products. And this is exactly why we need the cascading principle. We need to be promoting long-lived use of wood, not burning it. We shouldn't be throwing money at burning wood for energy when we could be incentivizing turning it into long-lived wood products. And just in case you don't believe me, here is the Natural Resources Institute of Finland, who are the ones who put out these data, stating that it was the increased use of forest energy, forest bioenergy, that drove consumption of unprocessed round wood to a record high level in the history of they've been keeping statistics. And 14% increase in round wood burning compared to the year before. Similarly, Estonia's logging for biomass is responsible for driving loss of the forest carbon sink. Estonian government data on logging volumes here in thousands of cubic meters for the last few years shows a general increase. This orange line is the percent clear cutting, so you can see that that's been increasing too. In contrast to that, I graphed up total bioenergy use, which is the blue line, and then exports, which is the pellet industry, which has been exploding. So the blue line includes the red line, but I graphed the red line separately just so you could see what exports were doing. Now, when we superimpose total biomass use as the red lines here, the red bars, consumption, including exports, over those logging data, you can see that, in fact, total biomass consumption, including exports, is now more than half of total felling in Estonia. So just like Finland, more than half is being burned for energy. And that doesn't even tell the whole story, because Estonia's record keeping shows the Joint Research Center has identified that they're actually burning about 2 million more cubic meters of wood than they're reporting generally. So it's actually even worse than this shows here. Many other countries are losing their forest carbon sinks. Here's the data for the EU as a whole on the top, which you already saw in a previous graph. But here we have Austria, Denmark, France, Latvia, Slovakia, and Slovenia, and there are many more that are losing their forest carbon sink and their land sink. Look at, remember, upward tilting lines, bad thing. We're losing the sink when the line is going up. This is a disaster for forests and a disaster for the climate. So, take home message, when you're in a hole, stop digging. We need to define primary woody biomass based on science in the Renewable Energy Directive. Policymakers must stop counting forest biomass toward renewable energy targets, end incentives and subsidies for logging and burning forests, promote the cascading principle, and prioritize efficient material use of all biomass, including secondary woody biomass. We need to grow forests, not burn them for energy. There's my contact information, and I've done a summary slide, which I will not go through because you've just seen my presentation, but if you ask for the slides, you will get this one handy slide that tells the whole story. So I will stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Mary. Well, you've all gotten quite a lot of information in a very short time. So I would like now to give our participants the opportunity to ask questions and to discuss. If you would be able to use the raise hand function, that would be ideal, because I cannot see everybody on the screen.
And I think we have to unmute people individually as they.
Yeah, I don't know whether you can do that in a one go thing or something.
I will
just trying to see whether I see any raised hands.
And we were going to stop the recording for the question section.
Exactly.
So I'll stop that now.